What's up, guys? This is Jordan. Today I'll be taking you through the overview of how we might lay out a year-round throwing plan for different ages of guys, depending on what they have going on, schedule constraints, stuff like that. So, looking forward to it. Let us know if you have any questions.
So just wanted to kind of go through some stuff, break it down across a couple different demographics we deal with, and talk some important just kind of side notes, some tools we'll use, and then a couple little brief overview items. Okay, so important things to consider. So what is your overall career goal? What does your workload look like throughout the last season, the last few months, the last couple weeks? Also factored into that kind of a little subtopic. Are you having any arm pain? Have you had any injuries? Things like that. And then also combine those two with age factors, and that kind of gives you a good picture of what should a time of year look like, what should your overall approach be, things like that, right? And so I'm going to kind of start from the bottom up in terms of the levels of baseball. So starting with youth. So when I say youth, I'm considering this like 10U to 14U, so like the ages where travel ball academy teams will start, right? Not necessarily like T-ball, things like that. If you're playing T-ball, coach pitch, or just like rec or whatever 9U baseball, just go have fun, right? Don't worry about too much else. Like play the game, get some practice in, enjoy it. If you get to the point where you're like in this age bandwidth and your career goal is something beyond just, hey, I just enjoy baseball and I just want to play it. It's, hey, I want to play in college. So you seek out a travel team or you start playing more consistently, whatever it is. This is where this stuff applies, right? And so based on time of the years, like the calendar of guys that we deal with up here in Wisconsin in a colder weather state is usually summer ball wraps up end of July, early August. So I'm going to consider fall being from like the end of summer ball through the end of when fall ball technically would be. For this age range, the younger athletes, so like less than 13U, so your 10 to 12-year olds, ideally, well, all of them should decrease the amount of competitive throwing. So play in less games, if any games at all. I would usually encourage a guy who's that age to play a second or third sport and just get away with it. If you still like to take some swings on the side, things like that, go for it. That's not what I would consider too stressful. You can kind of manage and control what you're doing. So that's what the fall should look like for those younger cats. For 13 and 14, you guys, I would say that's the age where like it's feasible to start considering playing in the fall and playing competitively in the fall, right? Because starting to get to the stage where you probably want to get accustomed to that workload, especially like if your career goal is you want to play professional baseball, Division I baseball, like the fall period is big for some of that stuff as you get into the middle upper levels of high school, like 16U, 17U, 18U. Especially like once you're a junior in high school, that fall is huge because that's when coaches can start talking to you and they can get out on the road and see you. Fall of your senior year, if you're a potential draft guy, is huge because I have things like Jupiter or other big tournaments. So starting to get used to it and get your feet wet with it is good. I would say you're going to want the volume to be lower, which a lot of the academies around us do a good job of that, not playing as much with their young guys in the fall or as late into the year, right? So they do a nice job with that. That's where that ideally not overdone comes into play, right? Adding a couple tournaments in the fall and staying in touch with it is good, but you don't want to do too much. Once you get to the winter, okay, so November, February, if you remember, I said I'll encourage a second or third sport. Ideally, younger guys, if you didn't play a second sport or you played a second sport and want to play a third sport, play another sport, mix in some baseball stuff on the side. But I would say all ages in this category at some point throughout the year should take some form of time off from throwing overall, right? Whether it be 2 weeks up to, I would say no more than 8 weeks because you don't want to go too far without it. Otherwise, you're just going to compress your time to build back up to get ready for the season. So somewhere in that 2 to 8 week range, but just go a little bit of time without touching baseball, right? If baseball is your only thing or you're just at a stage where your arm feels good, you've had no injury history, you got some stuff you need to work on going into the next season, the lower end of that can work. If you've had some arm issues, if you're playing another sport or whatever, or you're younger, take the longer end of that, okay? And then begin a ramp up after. I'll get into a little more of like exactly what a ramp up looks like later, but basically the longer and more gradual, the better. You don't want to quick spike how much you're throwing, right? You don't want to go from zero to just throwing two bullpens, three bullpens a week, throwing as hard as you can without having touched a baseball for that 8 weeks, right? So don't just take the time off and think you can just jump right back in and just go all out, right? You got to have a little bit of a progression to get there. Usually, the slower you throw, the less time you necessarily need to take, but we still want to be cautious with it. And then ideally for guys in this age range, somewhere in the 2 to 4 times per week throwing frequency is great. Like if you can do a little more, awesome. most kids that age, especially up here in Wisconsin, you don't have access to throw as much. You can't drive yourself. Like I said, I think they should be playing other sports. You might not have the time. I think somewhere in that range is great. Depending on how many days, it's going to look a little different on what you're doing, right? Because if you're throwing 4 or 5 times a week, you're not going to throw 4 or 5 bullpens a week or throw hard 4 or 5 times a week, right? But that's the general frequency I would say is good for kids that age. The spring and summer, throwing frequency shouldn't be much higher than games, especially for like those 13, 14-year-old kids who they might play in a league, they might play in tournaments, they might have practices. Usually what you're getting there is going to be good. You just want to do enough to keep your arm in shape, right? So if it's, hey, I have a 2-week break in between any games, get a good like intensive bullpen in to keep your arm healthy, right? Stuff like that. Pitch count progression and adequate rest are key, right? The days like when I was growing up, it was pretty commonplace for kid would throw a bunch of pitches on a Friday in a tournament and then a bunch of pitches Sunday, right? Those days should be past us. They're not necessarily all the way there because there's people that are either uneducated or just don't care still doing that. But like I said, the travel ball academies generally do a good job of this. Just because they have the numbers of guys who can pitch, who are competitive, and they just generally know what they're doing, right? And so making sure you're not going from throwing 40 pitches in week 1 to 80 to 100 the next week, right? You want to kind of take steps to get there. Those are keys, right? So that's what it should look like for youth guys. For high school guys, the timeline's kind of the same, right? That fall ball period of August, October. So if you're going to play fall ball, once the summer's over, don't fully shut down, right? If you have a tournament, usually it'd be like Labor Day weekend for a lot of guys, which would be like 4 weeks. Don't shut down fully for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, right? And then try to pick back into it. Just maybe take a little active rest phase, right? Just kind of ramp down how much you're throwing or how intense you're throwing, little deload, and then pick it back up from there, right? Keep your arm in shape. Don't go crazy and spike how quick you need to go from this level of throwing where maybe fully shut down to that level of being able to throw with intensity in games, right, for whatever pitch count is. The biggest thing with fall ball that I would say is if you are close to adequately skilled and your workload is good, fall ball is a good option, right? So that kind of comes back to this. Like, if your goal is to play Division I, like Power 4 baseball, like Big 10, SEC, ACC, Big 12, whatever it is, and you are 16 years old, you're at the start of your junior year, coaches can just start talking to you. Let's just say you're an arm. Let's say you're a right-handed pitcher. If you're a right-handed pitcher and you are probably 88 to 90, at least with a good breaking ball, ability to throw strikes, go play fall ball, right? Because you have something you can show to these coaches to get those opportunities. And honestly, the velo range is probably moving up from there. It's probably for a right-handed pitcher, if you want to go to an SEC school, at the start of your junior year, you probably got to be 90, 92, right? So if you're in the ballpark where you need to be, go ahead and play. I would say, honestly, like fall ball for sophomores, freshmen, it's going to be even more of like if you aren't exactly where you need to be and you're perfectly healthy, if those two things aren't taken care of, don't play fall ball, right? Because at the end of the day, like the coaches are going to be worried about the kids they can talk to more. So they might keep tabs on you, but if you are a sophomore, like fall of your sophomore year, throwing 80, 83, and you want to go play at that Division I school, maybe you got good breaking stuff, and you can throw strikes, and you compete. If you are in that ballpark, but your goal is to play at that high Division I level, they're not going to make offers to you at that time because they can't talk to you. You might as well use that time to extend your window to get better over that offseason, right? And that brings us into the winter. So active rest versus shutdown. So throwing competitively year-round, probably not a good idea because the stress is, you can't control all the stress, right? Some innings are more stressful than others depending on situation. Sometimes you go into an outing not feeling as well. Maybe you were sick, maybe didn't get good sleep a couple nights or whatever it might be, right? There's a lot of factors that go into it. That is a lot harder to control than a specific, okay, we're going to take an active rest phase. We're still going to throw, but we're not going to throw competitively in games, right? We're going to kind of ramp down the intensity, still work on some stuff, still keep the arm in shape. That's where an active rest comes into play, right? And the shutdown is just completely stopping throwing. The active rest, like let's say, for example, you take a 4-week shutdown versus a 4-week active rest phase. 4-week active rest phase, you're playing catch 3 times a week. You're working on a couple of mechanical things, whether it be with a tool like a medicine ball, water ball, plyos, even just baseball drills. You're doing it lightly 3 times a week. Shutdown, you're not throwing at all. When you get to the end of that 4 week phase, there's going to be a lot smoother transition to more intensive work. That's going to drive a lot more change and have a lot more like effect overall on your training from that active rest versus a shutdown. From the shutdown, you're basically going to have to start with that active rest for another couple weeks and then progress up from there, right? So those are all super important things. Ramp up. Basically, what a ramp up is it's gradually progressing intensity, volume, frequency of throwing, kind of working up the skill gradient too, because usually it'll start with, if you're a pitcher, you won't necessarily hop in and start throwing bullpens right away. Usually you'll get your arm in shape to the point where it can handle throwing on the mound at an intensity that you're going to get something out of, right? Because just hopping on the mound and throwing at 50% for more than a few throws in a given day probably isn't going to do that much for you. And honestly, it might make you worse because you might be building worse patterns. So that's where ramp up comes into play. And then from there, velocity, pitch design, command. This can also factor into the other two, but basically you want to look at what are your needs, right? Doing an active rest phase and then a good ramp up should take care of a couple of these things, right? If we're doing it the right way. Generally, like velocity phases, the velocity phase for a lot of high school kids is get stronger, put some good weight on, move better overall, transfer that to the field with your mechanical work, your drill work, and keep your arm in shape. That's usually more than enough to drive a lot of velocity change, right? You don't need to get into these super fancy programs of plyo velo, pull downs, things like that. Those are tools that I'm going to get into in a second and how we might use them. But you don't necessarily need to do that, right? And then you want to progress your workload. That kind of goes into the ramp up. Those are all important things for the winter months. And managing that around other sports is big. Basketball is usually the heaviest one that we see a lot of baseball guys play in the winter. Long season, a lot of workload on the court. It's doable to get a lot of this work in, but honestly, from what I've seen experience-wise, the velocity side of things might not take the biggest jump just because physically you're not fresh enough to get enough out of your throwing work or your lifting side, right? And so a lot of what I've seen work well with guys in basketball season is get their arm in shape with the workload progression and ramp up the right way. We can work on some of the arsenal work, like adding pitches, sharpening pitches, working on command, get mechanics fine-tuned to the point that when you get into the spring, your arm's in shape, you're ready to go, you get into games, and then you're out of that basketball mode where you're just fatigued all the time, and then the velocity will start to jump, okay? So that's what I've seen managing other sports with guys in the winter. Spring and summer, basically pitch count progression is huge, like I said, with the younger guys. I usually like to have a lot of my high school guys show up to the season ready to handle 40 to 50 pitches when they go off to like their pitchers and catchers week. And then from there you can progress a little bit, right? The coaches that throw their guys off the deep end right away are generally doing them a disservice because they're either going to break down or have worse performance after that, or kind of be a wave of the two things, right? Where maybe they'll be good one outing, then they'll be bad, then they'll be good, then they'll kind of feel like trash, right? So there's a lot of things that can kind of get thrown off by that. But having a good kind of step-by-step, so like a good rule of thumb is, okay, you get the pitchers and catchers week, which is usually 2-ish weeks before the first game can be played. Able to throw 40 to 50, add about 10 pitches a week, right? So then you're 50, 60 in a live outing the next week, and then you're 60, 70 in your first week of games, and then 70 to 80, 80, 90, things like that, right? The harder you throw, the more gradually you'll probably want to go, right? Because higher velocity equals higher arm stress. That's just what you sign up for with it. It's riskier to throw hard, but it also brings more rewards of playing at higher levels, easier to get guys out, things like that, right? So that's a big key in that too, is like protect your arm as the asset it is. Like if you're a guy who throws 90 plus in high school, be smart with what you're doing, right? Don't just go, oh, I can just do whatever and I'll be fine, right? Because usually you're either going to lose velocity, effectiveness, or health. Okay, one of those things is going to happen. And then the biggest thing in spring and summer, keep your arm in shape, right? So when you're in the summer travel season, don't just throw your outing on a Friday and then not pick up a ball until the next Friday, right? Keep your arm in shape. Keep that ability to handle like workload, right? It doesn't have to be throwing as hard as you can in between, but keep your arm moving, right? When you get to college and professional, things get a little bit different, right? Because there's a lot of factors at play, like what level you're at, where you are relative to like other people in the system or at the school, things like that. In fall, the first thing to consider is, did you play summer ball? Did you get lots of innings last spring, right? What did your workload look like? Because if you did play summer ball and you got a lot of innings, you probably don't need to throw competitively in the fall. And most college coaches are good about that, right? They're pretty good about telling guys like, okay, if they get back to campus in August, just played a full summer in a summer league, just played, like maybe it was a freshman who just got like 25, 30 innings in the spring and then another 30 plus, 30 to 40 in the summer. Like they probably don't need to throw competitively. They probably just need to kind of take what they did, work on some stuff, get a little bit better, keep their arm in shape, and then progress to get ready for the spring, right? Winter, what did you do in the fall, right? So it just brings it back to that. What does your anticipated role look like? If you're a reliever, you need to be ready to handle more frequency rather than longer outings. If you're a starter, the opposite, right? So that'll kind of tell you what your progression to get like ramped up looks like, because either way, you're going to need to handle peak intensity. And then if you're a reliever, you need to be able to handle that more often. So you need to start worrying about throwing harder more frequently. If you're going to be a starter, you just need to be able to handle a high workload in one day and then kind of recover in between, right? And then you want to build to a point that allows for a smooth progression into that role from the winter into the spring, right? So usually practice is going to start for different programs some point in January. You want to be there at a point where it's going to allow you a nice kind of clean progression, kind of like I talked about with the pitch count with the high school guys, from being at that whatever, maybe if you need to be ready to throw 80 pitches week one, maybe you're a Division I guy, which is usually like Valentine's Day. So mid-February, you show up early January. Subtract 5-6 weeks from that, 10 pitches per week, build from there, right? And then spring and summer, ball out, keep your arm in shape. That's the big keys professionally. The biggest, like I'm not going to go too much in depth here because there's a lot of nuance as far as like, okay, what level you're at, how old are you? Were you a guy that got a lot of money when you signed out of the draft, or were you undrafted free agent? Whatever it is, right? There's a lot that goes into it politically and just like overall outlook-wise. Biggest key is giving yourself adequate time to ramp up. Most pro guys get hurt in that February to April window when they're like fully getting going for the season, right? So giving yourself a ton of time to just build a lot of fitness, build the ability to handle stress slowly is going to allow you to stay healthier. And then the biggest thing is like don't rest for so long that you don't have time to get better, right? If you come in after the off season, you take 2 months off, a month and a half off, and then you try to get going, you're going to spend the first chunk of time just basically working back from the time you just took off, and you're not going to be able to get better at anything, right? So big keys there. Those kind of go together. Like give yourself enough time to ramp up and also just get better at stuff, right? And yeah, those are the big things with pro guys. So kind of went through different levels of baseball, different like scenarios, things like that. Some important notes. So overall, stress does not equal bad, right? There is stress. There's just stress from playing overall, right? There's stress from if you're a 12-year-old kid going and playing on the playground, right? Like stress on your body and on the system is not a bad thing. It's being inadequately prepared for that stress that's a bad thing, right? So let's take a couple of scenarios here. These are both like, these could look like ramp ups, right? So over the course of time, how much are you progressing workload and stress, right? In this situation where you just kind of, maybe you took a bunch of time off from throwing, and then you got to get ready for whatever it is, bullpens, progressing pitch count, things like that, and you have to take a big spike, that's where things get risky, right? If you take a ton of time, like maybe you extend this out more and you still got to get to the workload you need to, but you take a little bit of a lower sloped progression up there, that's where things are going to be okay, and you're going to be kind of putting all the eggs in the basket of playing it safe enough with your progression to where you won't get hurt, right? If you gradually expose yourself to just a little more stress over time and kind of build those blocks, eventually it's a big chunk of stress you've added, but your body's going to be a lot more able to handle it and able to adapt to it, right? The other thing, throwing does not equal game reps. These kind of go hand in hand, right? So shutting down from playing in games does not have to mean you shut down from throwing. Kind of like I was talking about before with the active recovery versus shutdown period, right? You could be shut down from playing in games and exposing yourself to the stress of going and throwing 70 live pitches to hitters once a week or twice a week and still be throwing and working on stuff, right? The last thing of these just kind of important notes is just trade-off of risk versus reward, right? At the end of the day, the less time you have to reach your goal, the more risk you're going to have to take to achieve a larger kind of reward, right? Because if you're a guy who shows up here, you're a senior, you throw 70, you want to play Division I baseball or just college baseball in general, throwing 70, you're probably going to have to bust your butt, take on a lot of risk because trying to get better in a quick window is risky. Okay, that's not a bad, like I'm not saying that's a bad thing to get that reward, right? If you're a pro guy who you're undrafted free agent, you got to show something that's going to make that organization keep you around. You got to take on the risk of maybe throwing a little bit more, throwing a little more intensely throughout the offseason to get that reward of hopefully sticking around and eventually making it to the big leagues. Now, the opposite end of that, like if you're the senior who you throw 93, you've got an agent, you got draft looks already, you're having calls with scouts, whatever it is. If you're that guy, or if you are Jacob DeGrom in the big leagues, right? You already reached a lot of the reward you want or are on track for it. You need to take less risk on, right? You can play it a little safer. You don't need to make as big of a jump. We can be a little more gradual with what we do with stuff. Okay. Now, getting into the last thing, tools that we'll use with throwing throughout the year, right? Radar gun is probably the number one thing. Like if I could tell a kid the number one piece of equipment, other than obviously if you're going to throw, you need a baseball at least. If I could tell a kid the number one tool to have for throwing, it'd be some form of radar gun, whether it be a pocket radar, stalker, using a TrackMan like in here. Having some form of radar feedback and just feedback overall is going to be huge for being able to progress stress, being able to know what your mechanics are doing, if stuff's working, things like that. Those are the big things, right? Manage and progress intensity and stress, objective mechanical feedback. Because if you're doing something better mechanically, the radar gun will tell you that, right? If like say you're working a pitching lesson and a pitching coach says, "Yep, that looks good. You're moving better. Your back leg's doing the right thing," but then you go throw on the radar gun and you're throwing slower or the same, like it's not doing anything for you, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what matters. If we're trying to get better mechanically, we should be getting more efficient with getting energy up into the baseball. Okay, and radar gun's going to tell you that. I think a lot of coaches who don't want to take the time to teach kids, or maybe they're in a large group setting where it's hard to get a rein on all the kids, don't want to use the radar gun as much unless it's like a high intensity day or a bullpen day, things like that. Just because like high school kids, they're gonna like even if it's a day where they're supposed to be 60%, they're gonna go throw hard probably if you get a gun out and they're not educated, right? But huge tool. Would really recommend having some ability to throw on that at least a couple times a week for every high school or just like overall thrower, right? Long toss can be used like a radar because obviously like if you're throwing it harder, probably going to go further. There's some spin stuff that can play into this and just like what like atmosphere, weather things that can play into this. But at the end of the day, like as long as you're throwing in a similar setting, throwing a ball 80 yards versus 100 yards, you're going to be throwing harder to throw 100 yards, right? There's going to be more margin for error though because of those things, like I talked about with atmosphere stuff. Like maybe you have the wind behind you or at you. Maybe you're a guy who carries the ball well. Like I myself, like I carry the ball really well. I long toss and can throw balls about as far as a guy who could throw 97, 98. Hardest I've ever thrown is low 90s, right? So a little bit more margin for error there. And also there's things like arc that come into play. So a lot of room to kind of have just not consistent comparisons, but can be used like the radar gun for mechanical stuff, for progressing stress, things like that. That's why it was like the initial return to throwing program from surgeries, right? Because something everyone can access is going outside and measuring distance, right? So it's a little bit easier. Another tool, plyos, weighted balls, things like that. Improving patterning, mechanical efficiency. Those are the big reasons we might use those. They're not bad or good as long as they're like applied well and you're doing drills that are going to drive the change that you want to see or keep patterns consistent that you want to keep consistent. They're great, right? Higher percent of your total volume should be in the off season with plyos, right? Like once you're in season and you're getting a lot of baseball reps on the field, you're going to want to take less reps with plyos, right? Just because you don't have that bandwidth. You want the game reps to kind of take the cake there. And the other thing to note is heavier plyos equal lower torque stress on the arm. This is where a lot of people get confused. The higher speeds from the light ball, like the lighter underload baseballs or plyos, those ones are going to have higher peak stresses, right? So in season, honestly, if you want to steal a lot of reps or maybe be able to throw at a little bit of a higher intensity, throwing slightly overloaded baseballs or plyos is going to help with that a little bit more. So you can kind of steal some reps. So especially if you're a bullpen guy and you need to like be ready to like throw with more intensity more often, the overloads are money for that because you get a little bit less stress and you can touch intensity a little more often. Now, pull downs, high intent constraint throws, like high intent plyo throws into a radar gun. So this is what people think of when they think of like a velocity phase, right? And kind of like I talked about before, like your velocity phase should be getting better physically, transferring that to the like onto the mound or onto the field, moving more efficiently, doing it at a stage that's going to keep you healthy. If you take care of a lot of that, you should have higher velocity, right? The pull downs, the high intense stuff, that's for preparing your arm for high stresses, right? So I view the pull down more as like okay, a lot of guys I see are going to throw a little bit slower in bullpens in the off season, in the indoors, in the winter than guys will when they get on the field, right? I see this with big league guys. I see this with good high school guys, college guys, whatever it is. If I get a guy ready to just like say a guy's throwing 88, 90 in bullpens all off season, and then he goes out onto the field and faces hitters and he's 92, 94, that's a little bit of a jump in stress, right? So being able to touch that arm speed and velocity in a pull down is going to be helpful for just like the body being able to handle that, right? That's where like bringing it back to the guys that show up to spring training and get hurt in professional baseball. A lot of times those are the guys where they've been throwing kind of easy or not necessarily easy, but not able to touch as high of velocities in the off season. Then they get in season and it's there, right? So that's a little bit of a spike in stress we want to avoid. So that's where those can come into play. High intent constraint or just pull down throws can also be just like stress test your movement patterns. Like if you've been working on something, throw it into a drill and see if it actually works at high intent, right? And then they can also improve movement patterns if you're picking the right stuff, right? So if maybe you're doing a kneeling throw to kind of constrain and work on the efficiency of the arm action or the upper half. That all kind of plays into this too, right? So a lot of information, but a lot of factors. Everyone's kind of an N equals one case with this, right? So if you have specific questions about this, hop in our DM, shoot us an email, whatever it is, and we'll help you out with it. But if you make good decisions here, there's not really a way for, as long as you're consistent, you're making those good decisions, like I said, there's not really a way for you to not get better at baseball, right? If you're making the right decisions with this. Obviously, things got to be dialed if you want to stay healthy with it, but that's where seeking out someone who has been through this and has worked with guys that have done it is really just like a game changer. Even if like training doesn't work, like just having the conversation or going in for an evaluation assessment or whatever it is, we're more than open to that. We're always here to help, and hopefully the information I provided today helped.